Chapter 8 of Army Life in a Black Regiment. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by FNH. Army Life in a Black Regiment by Thomas Wentworth Higginson. Chapter 8 The Baby of the Regiment. We were in our winter camp on Port Royal Island. It was a lovely November morning, soft and spring-like. The mockingbirds were singing, and the cotton fields still white with fleecy pods. Morning drill was over. The men were cleaning their guns and singing very happily. The officers were in their tents, reading still more happily the letters arrived from home. Suddenly I heard a knock at my tent door, and the latch clicked. It was the only latch in the camp, and I was very proud of it, and the officers always clicked it as loudly as possible in order to gratify my feelings. The door opened, and the quartermaster thrust in the most beaming face I ever saw. "Colonel," said he, "there are great news for the regiment. My wife and baby are coming by the next steamer." "Baby?" said I, in amazement. "QM, you are beside yourself." We always called the quartermaster QM for shortness. "There was a pass sent to your wife, but nothing was ever said about a baby. Baby, indeed!" "But the baby was included in the pass," replied the triumphant father of a family. "You don't suppose my wife would come down here without her baby? Besides, the pass itself permits her to bring necessary baggage, and is not a baby 6 months old necessary baggage?" "But, my dear fellow," said I, rather anxiously, "how can you make a little thing comfortable in a tent amidst these rigors of a South Carolina winter, when it is uncomfortably hot for drill at noon, and ice forms in your bedside at night?" "Trust me for that," said the delighted papa, and went off whistling. I could hear him telling the same news to 3 others at least before he got to his own tent. That day the preparations began, and soon his abode was a wonderful comfort. There were posts and rafters, and a raised floor, and a great chimney, and a door with hinges, every luxury, except a latch, and that he could not have, for mine was the last that could be purchased. One of the regimental carpenters was employed to make a cradle, and another to make a bedstead high enough for the cradle to go under. Then there must be a bit of red carpet beside the bedstead, and thus the progress of splendor went on. The wife of one of the colored sergeants was engaged to act as a nursery maid. She was a very respectable young woman, the only objection to her being that she smoked a pipe. But we thought perhaps a baby might not dislike tobacco, and if she did, she would have excellent opportunities to break the pipe in pieces. In due time the steamer arrived, and baby and her mother were among the passengers. The little recruit was soon settled in a new cradle, and slept in it as if she had never known any other. The sergeant's wife soon had her on exhibition through the neighborhood, and from that time forward she was quite a queen among us. She had sweet blue eyes and pretty brown hair, with round dimpled cheeks, and that perfect dignity which is so beautiful in a baby. She hardly ever cried, and was not at all timid. She would go to anybody, and yet did not encourage any romping from any but the most intimate friends. She always wore a warm, long-sleeved scarlet cloak with a hood, and in this costume was carried, or toted, as the soldiers said, all about the camp. At guard mounting in the morning, when the men who were to go on guard duty for the day are drawn up to be inspected, baby was always there, to help inspect them. She did not say much, but she eyed them very closely, and seemed fully to appreciate their bright buttons. Then the officer of the day, who appears at guard mounting with his sword and sash, and comes afterwards to the colonel's tent for orders, would come and speak to baby on his way, and receive her orders first. When the time came for drill, she was usually present to watch the troops, and when the drum beat for dinner, she liked to see the long row of men in each company march up to the cook-house in single file, each with a tin cup and plate. During the day, in pleasant weather, she might be seen in her nurse's arms about the company streets, and centre of an admiring circle, her scarlet costume looking very pretty amidst the shining black cheeks and neat blue uniforms of the soldiers. At dress parade, just before sunset, she was always an attendant. As I stood before the regiment, I could see the little spots of red out of the corner of my eye at one end of the long line of men, and I looked with so much interest for her small person that instead of saying at the proper time, "Attention, battalion! Shoulder arms!" it is a wonder that I did not say, "Shoulder babies!" Our little lady was very impartial, and distributed her kind looks to everybody. She had not the slightest prejudice against color, and did not care in the least whether her particular friends were black or white. Her especial friends, I think, were the drummer boys, who were not my favorites by any means, for they were a roguish set of scamps, and gave more trouble than all the grown men in the regiment. I think Annie liked them because they were small, and made a noise, and had red caps like her hood, and red facings on their jackets, and also because they occasionally stood on their heads for her amusement. After dress parade, the whole drum corps would march to the great flagstaff and wait till just sunset time, when they would beat the retreat, and then the flag would be hauled down, a great festival for Annie. Sometimes the sergeant-major would wrap her in the great folds of the flag, after it was taken down, and she would peep out very prettily from amidst the stars and stripes, like a new-born goddess of liberty. About once a month some inspecting officer was sent to the camp by the general in command, to see the condition of everything in the regiment, from bayonets to buttons. It was usually a long and tiresome process, and when everything was done, I used to tell the officer that I had one more thing for him to inspect, which was peculiar to our regiment. Then I would send for Baby to be exhibited, and I never saw an inspecting officer, old or young, who did not look pleased at the sudden appearance of the little fresh smiling creature, a flower in the midst of war. And Annie, in her turn, would look at them, with the true baby dignity in her face, that deep, earnest look which babies often have, and which people think so wonderful when Raphael paints it, although they might often see just the same expression in the faces of their own darlings at home. Meanwhile, Annie seemed to like the camp style of housekeeping very much. Her father's tent was double, and he used the front apartment for his office, and the inner room for parlor and bedroom, while the nurse had a separate tent and washroom behind all. I remember that, for the first time I went there in the evening, it was to borrow some writing paper, and while Baby's mother was hunting for it in the front tent, I heard a great cooing and murmuring in the inner room. I asked if Annie was still awake, and her mother told me to go in and see. Pushing aside the canvas door, I entered. No sign of anybody was to be seen, but a variety of soft little happy noises seemed to come from some unseen corner. Mrs. C. came quietly in, pulled away the counterpane of her own bed, and drew out the rough cradle where lay the little damsel, perfectly happy, and wider awake than anything but a baby possibly can be. She looked as if the seclusion of a dozen family bedsteads would not be enough to discourage her spirits, and I saw that camp life was likely to suit her very well. A tent can be kept very warm, for it is merely a house with a thinner wall than usual, and I do not think that the baby felt the cold much more than if she had been at home that winter. The great trouble is that a tent chimney, not being built very high, is apt to smoke when the wind is in a certain direction, and when that happens it is hardly possible to stay inside. So we used to build the chimneys of some tents on the east side, and those of others on the west, and thus some of the tents were always comfortable. I have seen Baby's mother running in a hard rain with Little Red Riding Hood in her arms to take refuge with the adjutant's wife when every other abode was full of smoke, and I must admit that there was 1 or 2 windy days that season when nobody could really keep warm, and Annie had to remain ignominiously in her cradle, with as many clothes on as possible, for almost the whole time. The quartermaster's tent was very attractive to us in the evening. I remember that once, on passing near it after nightfall, I heard our Major's fine voice singing Methodist hymns within, and Mrs. C.'s sweet tones chiming in. So I peeped through the outer door. The fire was burning very pleasantly in the inner tent, and the scrap of new red carpet made the floor look quite magnificent. The Major sat on a box, our surgeon on a stool. QM and his wife and the adjutant's wife and one of the captains were all sitting on the bed, singing as well as they knew how, and the baby was under the bed. Baby had retired for the night, was overshadowed, suppressed, sat upon, and the singing went on, and she had wandered away in her own land of dreams, nearer to heaven, perhaps, than any pitch their voices could attain. I went in and joined the party. Presently the music stopped, and another officer was sent for, to sing some particular song. At this pause the invisible innocent waked a little, and began to cluck and coo. "It's the kitten!" exclaimed somebody. "It's my baby!" exclaimed Mrs. C. triumphantly, in that tone unfamiliar